Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Peace is in the waiting room.
All right. Thank you.
Welcome.
All right. And we'll do a screen share. All right. We're under Jewish background, and we're looking at the concept of purity in the New Testament. This is an extremely important concept. Of course, we see it in the Old Testament, and it was even heightened in importance in the New Testament times. The Pharisees, especially, were adamant about being pure and that everyone should be pure. They enlarged the purity rituals and laws for the priests and made them applicable to everybody. So it really put a great stress on purity. I think maybe now that we can understand a little bit more about purity than before COVID hit. Because I would talk to my students about, the need to wash your hands. You need to wash your hands. I think probably a lot of them said, wash my hands. Why do I need to do that kind of thing? Because it's not part of their culture very, very often, at least not as often as I would do it. But if we can think of it in a spiritual kind of way as being COVID, where they say, wash your hands many times, be very careful. That is the way the Jews would have looked at um, ritual purity. We have to be clean before God. We cannot come into his presence if we are unclean. And so we must go through the rituals to become clean. In New Testament times, an important ritual for purity was taking a ritual bath. Wherever archaeologists have found Jewish homes, they have found baths called mikvaot, or a singular mikveh. Um, Outside the temple, there are many mikvaot, and people would come, men in one area, women in another, and they would uh, go into the baths and ritually become pure and ready to go to the temple. Here is a picture of one of them. So they would go down into the water. Of course, there were regulations, what kind of water it had to be, and that kind of thing. And it was believed that while ceramic and wooden vessels could become ceremonially polluted, spiritually polluted, that stone vessels couldn't. So stone vessels were the preferred kind of vessels of the Jews. In John chapter 2, we are told of Jesus turning the water into wine. And in verse 6, we are told specifically that the jars that were used there were stone jars. They were the jars used in the purification rites. And they probably looked like, like these stone jars that you can see now in the Israeli Museum. Now, these are large jars. I don't know if you can get the perspective there, but these are large jars. They hold a lot of water. And it was very probable that the um, jars that Jesus used were very similar to this. Other vessels, smaller vessels like cups and bowls, were also made of stone. They were made of soft limestone that you could turn on a lathe and get them nice and round like this. We read in the New Testament about the Pharisees demanding that the disciples of Jesus wash their hands before eating. It wasn't that they were concerned about the transmission of disease, it was that they wanted to be ritually pure. It was a religious concern. In Mark 7:3 and 4, it says, the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. And all of this washing had to be done in a very precise way. They had to use a certain amount of water. They had to let their hands drain down, had the water drain off their fingertips. They had to have it drain up off their elbows and go through a precise ritual. And if they messed up that ritual, they had to start all over in doing that. Notice that the leper asked Jesus, when he asked Jesus to heal him, he doesn't say, heal me. He says, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus doesn't say, be healed. He says, be clean. This was a concern. Of course, he wanted to be healed, but it was also a religious concern to be cleansed. Jesus redefined purity. His disciples didn't always wash their hands, at least not according to the Pharisees' ritual before eating. Jesus said that he was Lord of the Sabbath. He called the temple, the most holy place for the Jews, a den of robbers. So Jesus didn't follow all of the rituals that the Pharisees wanted him to follow. And you'll notice that some of those rituals depended on the holding to the tradition of the elders, not necessarily the Old Testament, but this other tradition that had grown up. Jesus wasn't afraid of becoming defiled. To touch a person that had leprosy would make you defiled. But Jesus touched lepers and he wasn't defiled. Rather, they were made clean. When the woman who was unclean with an issue of blood came and touched Jesus, he was not made unclean, but rather she was healed and made clean. When Jesus touched the coffin of a young man who had died, he was not made unclean, but the young man rose to life. In the Old Testament, the unclean makes the clean unclean. In the New Testament, the clean makes the unclean clean. So you see, it's just reversed here. Even in a marriage, when a Christian is married to a non-Christian, Paul says that the unbelieving spouse is made holy by the believer, and the children are not unclean, but holy. There is a sense of the holy being contagious rather than becoming unclean through touching what is unclean. Rather, that can be made clean by those who are already clean, by those who are followers of Christ. For the Christian, purity is more internal than external, but internal purity will show itself in holiness of life. Do you have questions or comments here about purity? All right. Let's look at Judaism's literature. There were three classifications of writings of the Jews. We have the Old Testament scriptures in both Hebrew and Greek, and then we have the Apocrypha, and then we have the Pseudepigrapha, and we'll look at each of these. The Old Testament scriptures in Hebrew. This is the way that the Old Testament was divided in or by the Jews in the Jewish religion. There was the law, or the Torah, which is the first 5 books. And then there was the prophets. And it was divided into former prophets and latter prophets. Now, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings were all considered prophets. Now, we would consider them to be historical books, but not the Jews. For them, it was former prophets. And then we had the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and the book of the 12, the minor prophets. So we have the law, we have the prophets, and we have the writings, then, is the third kind of literature here. We have the poetic books of Psalms, Job, and Proverbs. We have the 5 scrolls, Ruth, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and Esther. And we have the historical books, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Now, when I was in seminary, our study of the Old Testament was divided into these 3 sections. So our first core course on the Old Testament was law and former prophets. So it went down through Kings. The second one was on latter prophets. And the third course that we took was on the writings. So this is the way the Jewish scriptures looked in the Hebrew Bible. The Old Testament scriptures in Greek, the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, abbreviated LXX, which is the Roman numeral for 70, also was widely used in the Greek-speaking world. It was the main version used by the Greek-speaking authors of the New Testament. In fact, there is no evidence that the author of the book of Hebrews was even familiar with the Hebrew Old Testament. The oldest and most complete manuscripts of the Septuagint are contained in Codex Vaticanus. That's one of the major manuscripts, and Codex Alexandrinus. And let me just give you those. This is the way the books appear in these 2 manuscripts. And you can see that the order of the books are not the same all the way through. One has more books than the other. And so that was not all uniform. These manuscripts also contain the New Testament as well. So we have the Jewish scriptures in Hebrew and in Greek, and we have what is called the Apocrypha. There are several works which were written after the Hebrew scriptures, which were used by the Jews in the 1st century and have been used by the church since that time. This is the Old Testament Apocrypha. Apocryphal books appear in several of the Greek codices of the Old Testament and the New Testament from the 4th and 5th centuries. So if you look at those, the listings of those 2 manuscripts that I just gave you, you'll see that several of the apocryphal books are written there, are listed there. The Apocrypha is part of the Roman Catholic Bible, but Protestants see them as lesser value. The Apocrypha contains, however, important writings. It gives us important information about the time between the Testaments, and it has some good devotional literature. It is not, however, inspired the way the Old Testament and the New Testament are. Here is the Old Testament Apocrypha. according to the Revised Standard Version and the New American Bible. So you can see that some of the names are actually different in the two versions, but it's the same books. So this is the Apocrypha. We might call them deuterocanonical, secondarily canonical. So we do not see them as inspired, but as useful, as helpful. In your syllabus, there is a link to the Apocrypha online if you're interested in looking into that more. And then we have the pseudepigrapha. These works were mostly late in origin, and some were discovered at Qumran. Some of these works were apocalyptic in nature. And we'll get into apocalyptic in just a few minutes. But apocalyptic refers to a kind of literature that used very vivid symbols. Often they were grotesque, and they generally deal with visions of the end time. First Enoch, the Testament of Moses, Fourth Ezra or Second Esdras, Second Baruch, and the Apocalypse of Abraham are all apocalyptic writings. In the New Testament, the book of Revelation is done in an apocalyptic style. And here is just a listing of these books. We're not going to spend any time on them, divided by the kind of works that they are. Apocalyptic literature, testaments, the Testament of the 12 patriarchs, Testament of Job, Testament of the 3 patriarchs, etc. Expansions of the Old Testament legends, wisdom and philosophical literature, prayers, psalms, and odes, fragments of Judeo-Hellenistic works. So these are not considered truly inspired by either the Jews, the Catholics, or the Protestants. We also have the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are documents from an Essene community in Qumran near the Dead Sea in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC, actually going all the way until around 74 AD, when it was destroyed by the Romans. Now, we include these here because they give background on Judaism of the 1st century. This picture that we have right here is Cave 4. There were 11 caves, and just recently they have discovered a 12th cave. The reason that they're valuable for our study is that they give background material. These were preserved from the time that the Essenes hid them in these caves until they were found in 1947. So it's like being in a time capsule, going back and discovering these documents, and it gives us a picture, a window into their lives and their beliefs in the 1st century. We also have the Talmud, and the scribes who became the experts at the interpretation of Scripture made comments on passages, and this commentary was collected into a body of teachings called the Talmud. Now, the Talmud was made up of the Mishnah, the oral law, and the Gemara, the interpretation of the oral law. And let me just tell you, I'm not going to be asking you to be responsible for this part, the Talmud, on the midterm exam, but I do want you to be acquainted with it. The Gemara didn't exist at the time of the New Testament, so we will not go into that. There are two kinds of interpretation in the Mishnah and Gemara. The Halakha dealt with the law code. How do we keep these laws? Exactly how do we do it? And that's what the Halakha dealt with. Haggadah dealt with everything else. Now, there are two other sets of documents that I want us to look at that are important for first century Jewish studies. The first is the writings of Josephus, a first century historian. He lived in the first century and wrote several documents that give insight into Judaism at that time. He was a Jew who adopted many of the ways of the Romans. In fact, he lived in an apartment in the house of the Roman emperor for a while. So he adopted the Roman ways. Excuse me. He was a general in the Jewish army when the Romans came and attacked Jerusalem and Galilee. And he went over to the Roman side and actually fought for the Romans. He wrote several works, 4 works. He wrote Vita, which was his life experience. He wrote the history of the Jewish war, Jewish antiquities, and Against Apion, which was a defense of Judaism. So he's a first century Jewish writer. He does mention Jesus. He mentions John the Baptist. And he is important for getting information from during that time. Another Jewish writer was Philo. He was a first century Jewish writer from Alexandria. He combines literal and allegorical interpretation with the stress being placed on the allegorical. So he was a prolific writer. He attempted to make Judaism relevant to the Greco-Roman culture of that time. And he did that through allegory. Excuse my voice. Do you have any questions or comments at this point? Questions, comments? Yes, Diane? I can't hear you.
Someone was saying that Jesus may have, his teachings may have paralleled the Essene, some of the Essenic or the Essene teachings of the Essenes. Has anyone ever addressed that? You know, the simpleness of life and all that.
I would say that there are some parallels. Simply because Jesus was a first century Jew.
Oh.
And you would expect there to be parallels in what he said. But there was no dependence. He wasn't dependent on the teachings of the Essenes, nor was their teaching dependent upon Jesus. They were parallel. They were, at the same time, the Essenes were in Qumran. Jesus was in Jerusalem, Galilee. But Jesus didn't get his teachings from the Essenes. Other questions or comments?
Sir?
Yes.
Going back to the documents found in the Qumran community and Essenes.
Yes.
Without these documents, can we still compile the New Testament or other books other topics related to it as it is now? I mean, does our knowledge of the Bible dependent on these sources?
No, it's not dependent on these sources. the content of the New Testament has really nothing to do directly with those sources. The value of these documents in Qumran is to give us the setting for the New Testament, to help us understand first century Judaism. But there were no documents of the New Testament found at Qumran. So the one thing that Qumran does, it shows us the accuracy of our manuscripts of the Old Testament. The oldest manuscripts that we have of what we call the Masoretic text, the Old Testament in Hebrew, come from 1,000 years after Christ. And so we may wonder, did the content of this change over that 1,000 years? But Qumran shows us that it didn't, that the Old Testament was handed down very accurately year after year after year. And so that's something valuable that we get from the Qumran literature.
Thank you, sir.
Mhm.
Did you say that the Masoretic text is 1,000 years after Christ or before Christ?
After. The texts that we have now, the manuscripts that we have now of the Hebrew Old Testament come from 1,000 years after Christ. So, you may wonder, is it really accurate? Over the centuries, did it change? Now we're able to go back to the 1st century AD, 2nd century BC, and we're able to see the Old Testament scriptures there, and we can see that the ones that we have from 1,000 years later are very accurate. There was no major change in the scriptures over that period of time. So that's a really good function that we see from the Qumran literature. All right, let us go on and let us look at apocalyptic. We've used that term several times here. The word apocalyptic can refer to a kind of literature or to a kind of eschatology. Apocalyptic literature is distinguished from prophetic literature, but at times they blend together. Some parts of the prophetic works of the Old Testament have apocalyptic parts. For example, in Isaiah 24-27, or the book of Joel, or Zechariah chapters 9-14, parts of Ezekiel, and especially parts of Daniel have apocalyptic sections. In apocalyptic literature, the writer would give an account of a vision he had had. There was no "thus says the Lord." The apocalyptic prophets were writers rather than preaching prophets. They also wrote in the name of famous Old Testament characters such as Enoch or Elijah. We call that pseudonymity, writing in somebody else's name. They also used vivid imagery, beasts with multiple horns, heads, and so forth. Their eschatology has nothing to do with history. The Old Testament prophets saw a relationship between history and the time when God would intervene in history. So in the Old Testament, there's a continuation, there's a connection somehow between history and God's intervention. But that's not so with the apocalyptic writers. History is a dead-end street for them. We just need to hang on until God intervenes. So apocalypticism arose during a time of great discouragement for the Jewish people. They had attempted to be what God wanted them to be, and yet they were still under foreign domination. So many of them had given up, and it was like just we're just going to hold on until the end, until God comes in, intervenes, and takes care of everything. Much different from the Old Testament prophets. You know, the Old Testament prophets were preachers. They were saying, repent, keep the law, honor God, worship God in holiness, and that kind of thing. But we don't see that much in the apocalyptic writings. So it's more or less God is going to come in, intervene, sort out the problems, and we're just going to wait for him to do it. All right. The last thing we're going to look at in Judaism are the parties or the sects of Judaism. Josephus tells us of 3 parties of his day. He says, moreover, when I was a child and about 14 years of age, I was commended by all for my love I had of learning, on which account the high priests and the principal men of the city came then frequently to me together in order to know my opinion about accurate understanding of points of the law. Now, he says when he's 14 years old, all these great people come to him to find out his opinion about the law. He is not too humble. And when I was about 16 years old, I had a mind to make trial of several sects that were among us. These sects are 3. The first is that of the Pharisees, the second that of the Sadducees, and the third that of the Essenes, as we have frequently told you, for I thought that by this means I might choose the best. So he wants to choose a sect to join. So he looks at them and evaluates them. Now he also mentions a 4th party or sect, and that was the Zealots. Josephus decided to join the Pharisees. First of all, let's say that most of the Jews of that day did not belong to any sect. They belonged to the masses, what the Pharisees would call the Am Haaretz, the people of the land. These people were looked down on by those who occupied the places of respect in the various parties. Jesus was looked down upon because he mingled with the common people. Let's first of all look at the Pharisees. When we covered the Hasmonean rulers, we mentioned a group called the Hasidians or the Hasidim, meaning the pious ones. They were zealous for keeping the law of Moses, and they resisted the corrupt priests who ruled the nation without a great commitment to being pious before God. Most scholars see the origin of the Pharisees going back to the Hasidim. The word Pharisee means separated one, and Josephus describes them this way. These are a certain sect of the Jews that appear more religious than others and seem to interpret the laws more accurately. So they are very much into keeping the law. So the law was at the heart of Pharisaic religion. But the Pharisees were the religious liberals of their day. They believed not only the Old Testament, but also interpretations which applied to everyday life. This body of interpretation is called the tradition of the elders. And it was just as binding upon the people of the Jewish people, according to the Pharisees, as the law of Moses was. So they attempted to apply all laws though even those that applied to the priest, to everyone of that day. And that made the law much more stringent and difficult to keep. Now, this insistence on keeping the traditions as well as the law made for separation of Jews into categories. For example, the Pharisees could not eat in a house that didn't prepare food in the prescribed way, or that served food that had not been tithed on. So they found themselves able to socialize with a select group of people like themselves. Those outside the group were the people of the land. Now, the New Testament mentions scribes, often associating them with the Pharisees. The scribes were experts in the Torah, like a lawyer of our day is an expert in the secular law. Not all scribes were Pharisees, but they were all influenced by the interpretation of the Pharisees. Bruce Metzger gives 4 beliefs of the Pharisees. One is foreordination. They believe that God had chosen what is going to happen before it happens. So, sort of like the Calvinist predestination, although they did believe in free will. Secondly, immortality and resurrection. They believe that when a person dies, he is immortal, that life continues, and that there will be the resurrection of the dead at the end of time. Thirdly, they believed in angels and demons, and they had a detailed angelology. And fourth, the Pharisees recognized as the supreme authority in religion the written Hebrew scriptures and the oral tradition that comprised an accumulated body of Jewish teachers down through the generations. So all of this was binding on them according to the Pharisees. Now, Metzger describes the Pharisees this way. He says, as in other religious movements, the proportion of sincere, earnest adherents came to be outnumbered by those who were characterized by less worthy motives. Even the Jewish Talmud itself acknowledges the existence of several kinds of Pharisees, not all of whom were good and upright. It differentiates 7 varieties of and vividly characterizes 5 of them with descriptive adjectives that hold them up for ridicule. A, the wait a little Pharisee always has an excuse for putting off doing a good deed. Okay, now this is from the Jewish writings themselves. B, the bruised or bleeding Pharisee, in order to avoid looking at a woman, shuts his eye and stumbles against a wall so as to bruise himself and bleed. Now, he didn't want to see a woman and lust. So in order to prevent that, he would close his eyes and walk around and walk into things that made him bruised and bleeding. C, the shoulder Pharisee wears, as it were, his good deeds ostentatiously upon his shoulder where all can see them. D, the humpback Pharisee walks about stooped over in mock humility. E, the ever-reckoning Pharisee is continually, continually counting up his good deeds to balance them against his bad deeds. Your good deeds have to outweigh your bad deeds. And if they don't, then on Judgment Day, it's not going to be good for you. So you got to get those good deeds. F, the God-fearing Pharisee stands in awe and dread of God. And G, God-loving or born Pharisees is a true son of Abraham and a genuine Pharisee. Jesus gave the Pharisees scathing rebukes, and the Pharisees were prominent in planning Jesus' death. Then we have the Sadducees. The Sadducees were the party of the wealthy. They were particularly associated with the priesthood in Jerusalem. Now remember, this goes all the way back to the Hasmonean rulers. Some of them supported the rulers that they had, who were really pretty wicked, and that came all the way down to Jesus' day. Religiously, they were conservative. Josephus said that they did not adhere to the tradition of the elders or believe what was not taught explicitly in the Old Testament. So they did not believe in the resurrection of the body or the existence of angels or demons. The center of the Sadducees' power was the temple. And when the temple was destroyed in AD 70, the Sadducees disappeared. So we have no Sadducee documents telling what they believe, so we must rely on other sources. Okay, so the Sadducees party pretty much came to an end with the destruction of the temple. And then we have the Essenes. The Essenes are not mentioned in the Bible, but they are referred to by Josephus, Philo, and Pliny the Elder. There were about 4,000 Essenes in Palestine in the first century. If the Pharisees were the separated ones, the Essenes were the really separated ones. Like the Pharisees, they had their roots in the Hasidim. They denounced the temple and its practices as being corrupt. They withdrew into their own communities to keep themselves pure. And this was symbolized by their wearing of white robes. I should add here that not all Essenes withdrew into their own communities, but many did. The community at Qumran, from which we had the Dead Sea Scrolls, was such a community. They devoted themselves to strict and simple lifestyle. They were known for prayer, the study of scriptures, and baptisms and washings. If you wanted to join the community at Qumran, you had to go under probation for 1 year. They practiced asceticism, that is, depriving themselves of luxuries and physical pleasures. Their theology was very apocalyptic and legalistic. The extent of their legalism is shown in the fact that they were not allowed to use the bathroom on the Sabbath because they had to dig a hole for it, and that would be considered work. They went through many purification rituals. They also stayed in a state of readiness for holy war. They believed in two messiahs, a kingly Messiah and a priestly Messiah. And their community at Qumran was destroyed after the Romans destroyed Masada, perhaps in it would have been probably around 74 that happened. Since John the Baptist seems to be an ascetic, it's been speculated that he was an Essene because of his lifestyle and his living in the Judean desert. But that is speculation. And then finally, we have the Zealots. Josephus called the Zealots the fourth philosophy. Since they believed in armed revolt, they were called the Sicarii, the dagger people or assassins. Theologically, they were close to the Pharisees. In the first century, they advocated rebellion against Rome. For example, a zealot, although the term had probably not been coined then, an example is Judas of Galilee. In AD 6, he staged a revolt against Rome, and one of Jesus' disciples was a zealot. The zealots were active in the Jewish war of AD 66 to 70. The last remnant fought on the fortress of Masada, as we've said earlier. So the Romans attacked them, and in AD 74, destroyed the last of those who were resisting their rule. All right, questions, comments?
Yes, sir. I have a couple of questions.
Mhm.
If you don't. Number one, it is maybe to help my understanding. I might be confusing the terms, but you say that the Pharisees were the liberal ones and the Sadducees the conservative ones. To me, looks like, in my understanding, what liberal and conservative are, it would look like more the other way around. But can you elaborate that concept? Why is one more liberal than the other, and why do you choose that terminology?
Yes. By conservative, I mean holding on to the core, maybe the core beliefs without taking in other beliefs. So by conservative, the Sadducees only believed in the Old Testament. In fact, some people say they only believed in the Pentateuch. So they are very conservative in what they believe. You know, no newfangled beliefs for them. Okay. Now, the Old Testament does have the core of the teaching of a resurrection, but it is not prominent. And the teaching on the resurrection rose to prominence during the intertestamental times. Because of that, the Sadducees rejected belief in the resurrection. So because they were conservative. The Pharisees, being more liberal, did believe in the belief in the resurrection. There is not a lot of teaching in the Old Testament, for example, about angels and demons. But the Pharisees believed in angels and demons, whereas the Sadducees didn't. So in that sense, we would use the term liberal and conservative.
Okay.
Today we would look at it differently, because a conservative holds to what they have believed before. Well, that's what the Sadducees did. But if you would reject, for example, the teaching on the resurrection, we'd probably call you a liberal, today. So it's a little different today.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for the clarification, because that kind of is wait a minute. So
Right.
how that plays out with the understanding of those two concepts today.
Okay.
And my second question is, we know the influence of Pharisees in New Testament writings.
I'm sorry,
But
the influence of what?
The Pharisees.
Oh, the Pharisees. Okay.
Yeah. But do we know, or probably you know, but I haven't heard of any Sadducees who would be a disciple of Jesus?
No. I don't know of any. There were a couple disciples who were part of the Sanhedrin, the ruling body. That would have been Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. However, I doubt that either of them were Sadducees.
Okay.
Now, the Sadducees were prominent in the Sanhedrin. And we're just not told, and I don't know of any Sadducees that we can say was a disciple of Christ. The Sadducees were the power people. And most of them really wanted to get rid of Christ. He was threatening their income, threatening their power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Could it be? I'm sorry, I'm asking too much, but could
No,
it
it's
be
fine.
possible that those priests that Acts referred to were coming to faith, and maybe those who were in kind of enforcing Judaism upon the Gentiles, could those priests that were becoming believers in the Acts time, could they be from that Sadducees wing? I mean, there is no way to prove, but could it be a
Yeah.
possibility there?
To me, it seems doubtful, simply because of their ultra-conservative stand. Jesus believed in the resurrection. And of course, so did all the Christians. That was a core belief of the early church. And the Sadducee would really have to go through a theological change in order to hold to the teaching of Jesus. Of course, Pharisee as well, but more so the Sadducee. Yeah, that would
Thank
be
you.
my response.
Thank
Yeah.
you, sir.
Any other questions?
Was
Yes.
there I've always heard that there were certain priests or concept rather, that the more money they would accumulate, the richer they would get, would be a higher indication to the people that they were holy. Meaning the richer they were, the more holy they were. Is that a true concept? Or
Yeah, that was generally the belief of the Jews in those days,
okay.
that wealth, health were a sign of God's favor.
Wow.
So, you
Kind of like Muslims.
that's right. That's right. So if you were healthy, you were wealthy, everything is going well for you, then that showed you were pleasing to God. If things went bad, it shows that you weren't pleasing to God.
Wow.
Of course, they must not have read the book of Job, but yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yes.
So, can you just elaborate just a little bit on what you said about the Sadducees, that the center of their power depended on the temple, and when the temple was gone, then they disappeared. Is it anything to do with their wealth? Or?
Yes. They controlled the temple, and the temple was a money-making thing. That is why Jesus called it a den of robbers. So they would, when people came to the temple to offer sacrifice, many of them came from long distances. They couldn't take sacrifices. And so they had to buy sacrifices, and which they could do that in the courtyard of the temple, which was a good thing, because they needed to make sacrifice. But the problem was that those prices were way overcharged. They were overcharged. It was inflated. And so they were being taken advantage of. Also, they had to change money into Tyrian half shekels to pay the temple tax. That again, it was at a really poor exchange rate. And so the Sadducees were wealthy, and they got their wealth through the temple. So when Jesus comes and overturns the money changers' tables and opens the cages, he's saying something very significant. And the Sadducees did not take kindly to it and saw that he was done in.
So, sure, we can say that we can still see Sadducees
I'm
in
sorry,
churches today, huh?
it cut out. I
people-
couldn't hear you.
People making. I was saying that we could still see Sadducees spirit and some of the people that are making money in the church.
Yes, I am afraid so. Unfortunately.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it seems like the Sadducees had a big impact on Christianity today too, because the temple, the church is closed. There's no church at all. So that's kind of interesting too.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. All right. Other questions, comments? Hey, we have several women in this class, but I don't hear from any of the women.
I liked what you shared regarding the purity in the beginning of the class,
Okay.
like the concept of the clean making the um, unclean clean,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and how you took that verse on marriage. So I never looked at it in that perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Right.
Doctor, I just want also to ask about the zealots. You mentioned one of Jesus' disciples was a zealot. Are you pertaining with Simon? Simon the zealot?
Uh, yes, that's right. Jesus disciple. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I remember in Luke chapter 7, he mentioned also about Simon the Pharisee, the one who, about the girl who poured out the alabaster jar. Is this same with Simon or
No, those are different
okay,
Simons.
okay, doctor, thank you.
Right. Right. Yeah, you sort of wonder how Simon the Zealot got along with Matthew, the tax collector, who worked for the Romans. Maybe there were some sparks flying between them there,
Perfect teamwork right there.
All right. Hey, let us go ahead and go on. And okay, and we will go to our other screen share. And here we're going to look at the Greco-Roman background. All right. The world of the first century was ruled by Rome. Now, I should add that not all the world was ruled by Rome, but the world of the Bible in the first century was, going all the way from Palestine all the way to England. It was under the authority of the Roman emperor. Let's first of all look at their money. Jesus was once asked whether you should pay taxes to Caesar. And he asked for them to show him a coin. And he asked whose portrait was on it. And they said Caesar's. And Jesus said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Here is the denarius of Tiberius. Tiberius was the Caesar, the Roman emperor, at the time of Jesus. And here we have a picture of Caesar on the front. And it says, T. Caesar DV Aug F. Augustus. And according to Metzger, the full reading is Tiberius Caesar DV Augusti Filius Augustus, which is translated Tiberius Caesar Augustus, son of the divine Augustus. And on the back, It says Pontiff Maxim, which is short for Pontifex Maximus, high priest in the Roman religion. I believe the Pope, isn't the Pope, some of you have a Catholic background, isn't the Pope called Pontifex Maximus today? The highest priest? Yes.
It is called Sumo Pontifice, yes.
Yes. Not only did they use Roman coins, but they also used Greek drachmas, which is about the same value as the denarius, which was like a day's wages for a worker. And there were also locally minted coins. We've already mentioned the Tyrian half shekel. So local governments also made coins. It's sort of similar to Cambodia today. In Cambodia, they use the US dollar. For most transactions, especially larger transactions, they will use US dollars, but they also have a Cambodian currency, which they use for smaller amounts. So that's sort of the way it was during the New Testament times. In terms of the provinces of the empire, here we have a picture of them. There were two kinds of provinces, and you can see, let's just look to the lower right, we have Judea, and then right above that, Syria. If we go up and to the left a little bit, we see Asia there, which was a major province in New Testament history. Go a little to the left of that, we have Achaia. And then above that, we have Macedonia. And then Italia onto the left, where Rome was. There were two kinds of provinces, senatorial and imperial. The senatorial provinces were under the authority of the Senate, and they were overseen by a proconsul. And for example, Achaia, where Corinth was under the proconsul Gallio when Paul was there. The imperial provinces were under the authority of the emperor. And these were the ones that were more recently conquered, those on the fringes of the empire, where rebellions could more easily happen. They were under the direct authority of the emperor, and they were overseen by a prefect or later a procurator. Judea was an imperial province. One prefect there was Pontius Pilate. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back in 10 minutes. All right, Greco-Roman society. We're going to look at stratification. That is how the society was broken down into classes. In pagan society, the social strata was clearly defined. There were aristocrats, there was a small middle class, and a large number of poor people or plebs. The largest group of all was slaves. The aristocracy made up primarily of wealthy landowners and those in political power. The middle class in New Testament times was very small. The plebs or plebeians often were worse off than slaves. at least the slaves were fed and housed, while some of the poor, free poor, were destitute. And then there were slaves. Slavery was a widespread institution in the Roman world. Estimates of the proportion of slaves range from 1/5 to over 1/2 of the population. Slaves were considered chattel, animate machines, like any other work animal. They had very few rights under the law. The slaves were allowed common law marriages, but the children were the property of the owner. Slaves were permitted to join guilds or associations to meet their social or religious needs. In those guilds, they were on the same footing as free people. Where did slaves come from? Well, there are several sources. Birth. If you were born to a slave, you were a slave. The taking of abandoned children. This is one thing that was done often in the Roman Empire. It's called exposure. And often those children would be put into slavery. The sale of one's own children. So if you were in debt, you may have to sell your children in order to pay off your debts. Or the sale of oneself for the same reason. Criminals were at times made slaves. Some people were kidnapped, made slaves against their will, and also prisoners of war. Slaves could get their freedom through a process known as manumission. This could be done in different ways, but the way that has most relevance for the New Testament students was a method known as sacral manumission. If a slave could, over time, save his money, he could possibly buy his freedom. If he was able to save the money, he would deposit the money in the temple of some god. His master then would go through the sacred rigmarole of selling him to the god. Technically, the man was a slave of the god, but in people's eyes, he was a free man. Here is an inscription from the year 200 or 199 BC, found with others on a wall in the temple of Apollo in Delphi. So this is placed on the wall of the temple in Delphi. The Pythian Apollo, that's the god, bought from Cisobius of Amphissa, that's the person who did have the slave, for freedom a female slave whose name is Nicaea, by race a Roman, at a price of 3 silver minas and half mina. Former seller, according to the law, was Eumnestus of Amphissa. I'm sorry, the Cisobius was the one who bought. He has received the price. The deed of sale Nicaea has entrusted to Apollo for freedom. Now, so there is a slave. The god buys the slave. The slave then is no longer under the ownership of the former owner, but is now considered a free person, even though he belongs to the god. Does that remind you of anything in the New Testament?
Philemon? Onesimus?
It sounds like what Jesus did for us.
Sorry, Peter, I forgot to put in my headphones. Go ahead.
Does it remind of when Paul wrote to Philemon?
All right. We could think of that. And also, what about the concept of the atonement? Anything that might have parallels here?
Yeah, it's basically the price paid by Jesus for our sake, so we became slaves of God, although free to the eyes of people.
All right. All right. What is that called? What is that process in the New Testament called?
Redemption.
It's called redemption.
All right. Redemption. We were slaves of Satan, bound by sin. Jesus paid the price for our freedom. What was the price that he paid?
His life.
All right. His blood, his atoning death paid for our freedom. Now we belong to God. We are slaves of God. And as slaves of God, we are actually free. We are free from that former thing that bound us. The price that is paid is called the ransom. So the process is redemption. The price is called the ransom. Slavery was an important part of Roman society. Now, we also know it was a terrible part of Roman society. But people have said, well, why didn't the church combat slavery, condemn slavery? Slavery was such a part of Roman society that, it would be like today saying we need to get rid of electricity. It's just inconceivable that our culture could go on without electricity. It was the same thing with slavery in the first century. They could not conceive of their society going on without slavery. But the seeds of its destruction were planted by the early church. And in time, when the Christians came to power, they did away with slavery.
Sir, can I ask a question, please?
Yes.
In that perspective, do we say that the ransom was paid to Satan?
That is one part where the analogy breaks down.
Mm.
The ransom was not paid to anyone.
That's right.
So God didn't give Satan Jesus' blood. So that part of the analogy doesn't carry through, but it is a true and interesting way of looking at our redemption. And there are many analogies for what Jesus Christ did for us: justification, adoption, and all of these, reconciliation. All of these are different ways of looking at what Jesus Christ did for us on the cross when he saved our souls. Now, if we look at, there we have it on PowerPoint. If we look at the way the Roman Empire breaks down by category, here we have 7 categories. And this is from Bruce Longenecker, Remember the Poor. At the very top, it's called ES1. We have the imperial dynasty. This is the Roman senatorial families and the local royalty. The regional or provincial elites, the equestrian families, provincial officials, some freed persons. And we have the municipal elites, wealthy men and women who do not hold office, and some freed persons. All of those together make up about 3% of Roman society. And then ES4, those with a moderate surplus, some merchants, some traders, some freed persons, some artisans, 15%. ES5, stable near subsistence level, many merchants and traders, regular wage earners, artisans, 27%. At subsistence level, small farm families, laborers, artisans, wage earners, most merchants, this is 30%. And then below subsistence level, this would be some farm families, unattached widows, orphans, beggars, and the disabled at 25%. Now, Longenecker says that Erastus, Gaius, and Phoebe were probably ES4 status. So that would be a moderate surplus. He says that Stephanus, Philemon, and Crispus were probably either ES4 or ES5. So that would be moderate surplus to stable near subsistence level. And he says that Aquila and Priscilla were probably in the ES5 or ES6 level. Stable near subsistence level or at subsistence level. There were people in the church who were not poor. So we can't say that everybody in the early church was poor. There were some people who were quite well-to-do. While there were people in the early church from most of these levels, most of the people in the early church were from level ES5. Most were not from the absolutely lowest level. So ES5, again, stable near subsistence level. Okay, do you have any questions or comments here about stratification in the Roman Empire?
Yes. So, like,
Yes, Rachel.
was this similar to the caste system, and people like look down upon others at a lower level of the system?
I'm not that familiar with the caste system, so I don't know if I can actually say. But I think that there was probably more fluidity here than the caste system. You could go from one level to another in the Roman Empire, probably easier than in the caste system.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, we will stop here. We have a lectureship in 10 minutes. And we will see you on Friday. On Friday, be sure to know what you want to write on. Now, you can write me and bounce it off me, and I will give you my opinion. And so plan on that for Friday. All right. God bless you.
Thank you, Doctor.
We'll see you then.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.